Hello, everybody, and welcome to this very special webinar about the future of work in finance. I'm joined by three leaders in the space, leading the charge on what it means to be working remotely in a modern workforce. But before we get started, I will let you guys trickle in. So if you want to just, as a ritual, we've always asked people where they're tuning in from. So please let us know where you're tuning in from. Would love to know where you guys are from. So I see Bristol, New York, Venezuela, wow, Berlin, Paris, wow, so all over the place. San Francisco, yes, Pedro, Portugal. Sorry about that. So in the spirit of future of work, I'm assuming all of you folks are also working remotely. So Lily, where are you tuning in from? Or where are you?
I'm in Nashville, Tennessee.
Okay, cool. And Michael?
Well, I'm actually in the southwest of Germany, in the beautiful wine region Palatinate.
Cool. And Pedro, you are from?
I'm in Portugal.
Cool. So lots of Paris, Dubai, very cool. San Diego. Okay, cool. So obviously a lot of people tuning in from all over the place, and I think it's very fitting for this topic. So before we get started, I just wanted to remind you guys, if you don't know what CFO Connect is a global community of more than now 8,000 finance leaders from fast-growing startups and Fortune 500 companies. We bring together the most experienced professionals in finance to learn, exchange, and build meaningful connections through events, expert resources, and curated networking opportunities. CFO Connect is powered by Spendesk, which has helped us to put this event on. Spendesk is a complete spend management platform that gives you 100% visibility into company spend. You get a 7-in-1 software with corporate cards, invoice payments, expense reimbursements, approvals, budgets, reporting, compliance, and pre-accounting in one simple, scalable solution, which is designed to save time and money across the entire spending process. So that's my little introduction. We will save time at the end for your questions, so make sure to just pop in questions in the chats. And we will take those at the end. So also one final reminder too is that this will be recorded, and we will send you a recording of the talk after it is complete. So let's get started. If you can start us off, Lily, what is your background and what is your current role at your company?
Great. Hi, I'm Lily. I'm the VP of Finance at Loom. Loom is building asynchronous video messaging for work. I've been at Loom for about 1.5 years now. Before Loom, I was at Samsara and came from a private equity and investment banking background before shifting into operating.
And Michael.
Sure, yeah, hi folks. So my name is Michael. I'm currently the CFO at Pitch. I started in July last year. Pitch is building the first complete software for presentation or presentation management platform. And yeah, we are sort of striving to empower modern teams to really give out their best thinking. And yeah, I have a background in management and technology at TU Munich, and then did my master's in finance and economics in London. I started my career in general management consulting, and then after some time moved over to the startup environment where I spent the last 6.5 years, first at a company called Freeletics, where I sort of more had a kind of a business development chief of staff kind of role. And then I joined Personio, a leading HR tech company, also based in Munich, when they were around 15 employees back in September 2016, so very early on. There I also headed up finance, legal, and analytics, led some like the 4 major financing rounds from A to D, until then also making Personio unicorn in early 2021. And yeah, and since July, as I said, now heading finance and legal at Pitch.
Cool, thank you. And to round us off, Pedro.
Hi everyone, I'm Pedro, VP of Finance at Remote. Remote is a disruptive global payroll, tax, HR, and compliance solution for distributed teams. So allowing and enabling any companies to hire anyone, anywhere, democratizing access to wealth and for individuals and access to talent for companies. I've been with the company for 2 years. I joined, we were 19 people. We are over 1,000 people today. And so have experienced the whole journey of building the finance foundations and the scalable solution from always a distributed focus. And previously I have a background in investment banking and M&A, and started focusing in early stage in 2016.
Cool, thank you. So let's just start off with a first question. So Michael, as we've seen the advent of remote first and distributed teams now coming strongly, how has your role changed day to day in this new world?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I mean, I would say in general, independently from remote first or not, I'd say the beauty of working in a startup is that the role is constantly changing and evolving on a day-to-day basis anyway, especially since I've mostly worked for companies that are in hyper-growth mode, which means that we are essentially building the plane while flying, which in general also means you need to constantly be open and also adapt to change. I think then in addition to that, in finance, I feel it's specifically important due to the fact that finance is still one of the late adopters when it comes to new tech, but also there has been a lot of innovation being introduced in the last couple of years, which is yet another reason for being open, but also eager for constant change from my point of view. But then also to your question, I think when moving to a fully remote setup, this, of course, as most likely for most of us, this was not something that we planned for, but was to a large extent driven by when the pandemic hit us, right? So therefore, initially, I think it has been very challenging for both me and the team. For example, at Personio, given that the team was junior, but also there was an absence of proper remote processes, tooling, and instruments to really keep the team engaged and informed, without now suddenly having the possibility to sit down or meet ad hoc or catch up informally, or all of this. So I think now with Pitch, which is actually a remote-first company by choice, we've consciously built up a much more asynchronous way of working, I'd say. So less face-to-face meetings to just provide updates or share results, but also generally being much more conscious about dedicating the time to discuss and collaborate and work on certain projects in a focused manner. I think for me personally, I'd say, clear communication, proper prioritization, but also really thorough listening. And then also at the end, connecting well across all levels of the organization has become even more critical, especially because it is much more difficult to get grounded in a new organization if you haven't met people in person. And also it's much more difficult to stay on top of all the developments in the company if you're growing fast, but you don't see people at the coffee machine anymore.
Oh, definitely. And Lily, I think Loom is remote first by nature, and you guys probably use Loom a lot to communicate. But in your career, did you see any massive changes, or does anything stand out to you as you kind of entered into this remote first world?
Yeah, so I think a couple of things. I think the first is that you have to be incredibly intentional about your communication. And And by that, I mean, as leaders, we repeat and repeat and repeat ourselves. And I think that's even more critical in a remote first environment. Loom obviously helps with that because you can actually just like watch the Loom on repeat, but even outside of Loom, Slack, email, just communication. I think we always assume that communication is getting read and consumed across the company when it really like falls in this Slack vortex. So being really intentional. I think the second thing that's worked really well for us is actually spending time in person, which sounds a bit hypocritical for a company that's remote first, but actually spending the funds that we would have, used for offices and in-office meals elsewhere to build that social connection and fabric. Even meeting someone in person for the first time, especially if your team is scaling incredibly quickly, just builds that additional connectivity and fabric where they're no longer an avatar on your screen. They're actually, a fully formed human being. It's something that's worked incredibly well for us, especially as we've been hyperscaling and adding folks across the business.
Right. And so Pedro, when you look forward and you think about the finance function in this remote first world, do you think that structurally and it'll change? Like, will this be impacted at all? Or will we kind of remain with the legacy structure of the finance team?
Structure-wise, I think it shouldn't change massively. What I think is happening a lot is the early adoption, as Michael was mentioning, of tooling and software. Like you need to build all the collaboration on cloud solutions, or at least collaborative tools. And I think that is a critical change that has been happening. A quick push for that, an acceleration on early adoption of tooling that can enable the finance functions. Excel, when everyone is in the same room, does not work anymore, and it's not scalable. And we need to invest heavily on that. And I think something that we have anecdotally have been experiencing is the need of hiring experienced folks, at least at the beginning of a new function in the finance teams. I think this happens across the organization, but given how specialized some of these functions are, hiring some very experienced folks that can be independent, dedicated, and being autonomous and take a lot of ownership will help massively, which then obviously drives the tooling as well. So there is a vicious circle there. But these are two critical steps that I think may change slightly from a previous setting where we were not fully distributed.
So do you think that for junior folks, it might be a bit harder to break into the finance industry with this more remote first setup?
I don't think it will be harder. What I think is when you're building your team, usually starting bottom up, because everyone is in your office and could work more or less because you share experiences very quickly. In a more distributed setting, you start building the team slightly the other way around, with more experienced folks, and then adding the capacity as you build the functions and you build the processes and you build the policies, and then you bring the capacity to drive. I don't think it made it harder. I think it actually made it easier, because now you're enabling anyone anywhere to join a company. And something that was highly localized 4 years ago, now it's becoming fully distributed, and my teams goes from Korea to East US, so it's everywhere.
Cool, thank you.
To briefly add to this, I'd also say I fully agree with Pedro on saying, the general experience is something that comes more and more into play when it comes to being able to work remotely. But also, I think that in general, the role or the expectations towards the roles will also change, in the sense that specific communication skills will be much more important, and also in general the finance function is in the midst of a change, I'd say, towards the expectation of fulfilling more of this kind of a business partnering role, I'd say, where you also need to be able to interact much more with stakeholders. You also need to generally be more tech savvy in order to be able to not only just create a reporting, but also really understand the entire data set from beginning to end, as well as the different drivers towards that. And I think this even enables huge chances also for junior folks through a different skill set and a different education to also be extremely value adding from the get-go in the finance world.
And I think that segues nice into our next question, is what kinds of new skills, hard and soft, Lily, do you think this new finance person will need to have in this distributed world? Obviously, you talked a lot about communication, but are there any other skills that come to mind?
Yeah, I think Pedro kind of referenced this as well. For us, one thing that we're testing for now and that we're probably rotating towards is aptitude. And so not just looking for experience, but especially for more junior folks, can this person really take ownership? Is this person really excited to show up to work every day in a virtual setting where, you know, I'm not sitting next to them and I have no idea if they're actually at the computer? And in addition to communication, is this person actually able to motivate themselves in an autonomous manner when we're really distributed? It feels like communication at work, as much as we try, just becomes a lot more transactional in a remote setting. You send a message to someone when you need them. You don't send them, you know, a message to just like hear about how their day is going. And so does this person actually adapt well to that environment and is able to build those sorts of bonds that, you know, Michael mentioned in terms of cross-functional business partnering? I think finance in general as an organization covers so much surface area across the company that the more that you're able to communicate really clearly, work autonomously and take ownership. And then third, figure out how to build those bonds and those trusting bonds cross-functionally, just make you a better partner up through the ranks.
And is there any way you think you can actually track that to make sure that those people are following through with it and really fitting the bill?
Yeah, I think one thing that we do is, I mean, these are really tactical strategies, but the more that you can centralize around public forms of communication, so even using public Slack channels versus email, I think is really effective to see, is there follow-up? Are people actually engaging? The second thing we try to encourage is we encourage a lot of Loom usage, which is unsurprising. And in Loom, you can actually see viewer analytics and engagement, right? So is this person, I can actually see if someone on my team is explaining something in a way that I think is clear, give feedback to that, even if I'm not present in a live setting for that conversation and kind of follow up to do mentorship and coaching that way. As much as you can consolidate communication to async and public channels, I think is something that we found really helpful for us.
Great. And now, Pedro, looking at technologies and tools in this new world, do you have any go-tos? What are your favorites, and what do you think will become the staples in this new era?
Remote is the worst example in the world for this, because we moved right into the hardcore ERP layer of tooling. So really jumped the more like the easier to implement and more user friendly type of solutions. But for us had a reason. Like, we are in 65 countries today. We're close to 65 countries. We have 100 entities incorporated. So just managing this scale is very different from the usual setting where you have a couple of entities and you can work out the consolidation in a relatively easy manner. So we went direct to SAP S/4HANA. We went direct to Coupa as an accounts payable solution. So we are building the enterprise layer from very early on, because we know we'll need it very, very soon at that scale. So we moved that quickly in that direction. But I think the story is there. Like, you need to adapt the tools to, or bring the tools that adapt to your needs. And if you are more enterprise, like remote is today on the finance side, cool, invest on that. But if you want, if you are a smaller company or fast growing, but you have one entity or it's an easy setup, like, bring those SaaS tools. You scale out of them, or you scale with them. So those are really needed. And and the more, as Michael was mentioning, like the more the folks are tech savvy on the finance teams, the better it is, because they can really enable the use of these tools, and to bring data analysts into this tooling enables reporting at a much deeper level from the traditional P&L, which means very little and says very little on the actual operational and financial management side of the business. And so adapt the tooling to your needs, but also think what's next, because implementation is expensive, adoption is expensive, but also migration from tools to tools, it's super expensive.
Great, thank you. And so Michael, if you had one bold prediction for how finance teams will evolve in this new era, what would it be?
Yeah, that's a tough one. But I mean, I'd say if I combine sort of a bold prediction with a wish, it would probably say that I think finance will be disrupted by game-changing technology at some point. So there will be robotic process automation, AI, machine learning, that will have an impact on how we are doing things, and this will help us hopefully to get rid of all the manual, the repetitive, and the boring tasks. But at the same time, it will also empower finance people to have a seat at the table where the important strategic decisions are made. And I think that is sort of my wish, that ideally we can sort of embrace this change and contribute to it. Because while it might sound scary at this point, I think if we manage to achieve this, then it will make the finance area even more fascinating and business critical, in my view.
Cool, thank you. And Lily, is there do you have one golden rule to succeed in this digital first world that you follow?
I don't know if it's a golden rule, but something that I'm trying to develop and coach myself on too is that our home lives and our work lives are so blurred now that actually having that mental space and capacity to reset yourself every week, I'm finding is really critical. I know that's it's more of a personal recommendation, not a work-related recommendation, but I do think that especially as we're, entering what might be a down cycle in our market, and as we look, out into the next 12 to 24 months, it looks a bit scarier than the past 5 to 10 have looked in tech broadly. Like having that space for yourself to step away from your tools and your systems and your team and your computer, and kind of having that protected space for me at Saturdays I think it's helpful for longevity.
Cool, thank you. It's a good answer. I like it. And last question, actually, for Pedro. Obviously, you guys kind of proliferated throughout the pandemic, and you guys grew very your looking back, was there anything you would have done differently when approaching this evolution throughout your early on time?
I think there is an interesting challenge on how the human mind thinks. It's very hard for humans to conceptualize exponential growth. And we are much more accustomed to linear trajectories than exponential growth. Like we are not bacteria, which develop exponentially. And looking back, I think trying to embrace much earlier on the true understanding and training of understanding what exponential growth means, I think it's super important. Because when you are in this trajectory, usually when you think you need something, it's already too late. And the thing is, by the time you get it, you're already 2 steps behind. And usually already in the startup and the successful startup world, you're already playing the catch-up game. But when you are going in this super fast trajectory, as folks here have been experiencing as well, and really trying to up your game into what we're going to implement, what's the next step, and really being intentional about the next decisions that you make on the business. I think that's something that was a critical learning throughout the last 2 years as we've been through this exponential growth.
Cool, thank you. I think it's a nice place to end the conversation and switch over to the questions from the audience. So there is one question that caught my eye at first. So we can just go around the table. What are the top 3 finance function tools you could not live without in your company? So we'll start with Lily.
Yeah, these are slightly adjacent. We're on NetSuite from an accounting system right now. We actually transitioned relatively recently from Xero, and just the step change for our accounting function has been critical. I know Pedro's laughing because we're so far behind in terms of systems. So that's one. The second I would add is like a really great BI. We have a really wonderful data team. We use Tableau and Snowflake, Snowsight with Snowflake. Data and analytics. I know it's not directly finance, but it is critical to understanding your business, your metrics, and understanding where your levers are. I think the third one that I actually be curious on the third, I would love to add a really great financial planning tool. And I think there's very much a developing market these days for financial planning tools, new age, that are targeted towards SMB and startups. But, trying to look a few steps ahead. Curious to hear what you guys are using that you love, but have heard a lot of bad things about Anaplan and Adaptive, not to call out any tool. So curious about what that new gen looks like, but I think that would be our third. Right now for us, it's Excel and G Sheets, which is traditional, but right now it works.
And Michael, for you at Pitch?
Yeah, so I mean, in general, we as a company, we are overall just at the beginning, so around close to 200 employees by now, which means that we will still have to go through some of those challenges, such as implementing an ERP system. We are still on the very classical German DATEV setup, which is definitely not a tool I love, but a tool I need to work with. So it's still a tool which right now I couldn't live without, but we will, over time now, also as we are striving to grow quickly going forward, also introduce a classical ERP system. But maybe to add some other context, I think on the, let's say, SaaS management side, given that as we said, there's a lot of SaaS tools out there, and what I find particularly helpful, especially if in a fast-growing organization where you don't necessarily have a procurement team that can help you with, there's some really cool SaaS spend solutions or procurement as a service solutions such as Sastrify, which we, for example, are working with, which help us to really scale down costs on the SaaS side without having to invest a lot of time on our end to negotiate those contracts, which I think is truly great. I think on the planning side, for example, to answer your question, Lily, we are ourselves also using spreadsheets, obviously, for the fact that we are really early on, but I actually looked into the market before doing that, given that we've also gone through the painful exercise at Personio to up beyond 1,000 employees, still planning with several spreadsheets all over the place. And I think two tools which I find very interesting while they're still early stage would be Pigment, but also Abacum, which are very interesting solutions because they really have this approach to try to do a decentralized planning, but also something which is extremely lean and similar to Excel, so that even those folks that are used to Excel still know how it's going to work.
Thank you. And Pedro?
Yeah, I mentioned we use SAP S/4HANA as our ERP, and that's critical for our success. Like the amount of reporting that we need to do on a very regular basis is enormous. Another one, I agree with Lily on the data side. Like it's critical that you have good visibility on what's going on, not only from the structuring side but also from the BI perspective. It's something that we have been investing heavily, and even on the finance team, we are building that capacity together with the data team on the engineering and analytics side. So it creates a critical success step for us. Another one that has been, and I think is shared with everyone, the pain of no real like interesting and connected successful planning tools. So you always default to your old but reliable Excel. works. It works. Like there's nothing you can do around there. Like that thing is just. It's easy. It's easy for folks to plug in. It's easy for people to understand, to track. So we certainly need to scale there, especially as we have all our data across SAP and our internal data warehouse, but still behind.
Cool, thank you, Pedro. So one question that seems to be the most upvoted at the moment is, what are your biggest pain points today? I know it's a very broad and vague question, but if you could think of one or two major pain points that are holding you back, does anybody want to just jump in and shout some out?
Well, one I think Lily touched is how are the markets are playing out, and that's not an intrinsic playing point. It's a market, it's extrinsic. But I think it's a super interesting stage for finance folks. Is you need to work so closely with the business in terms of planning, understanding efficiencies. What are your constraints? What are your enablers? What are the levers that you can pull? And how can you play? Like finance just becomes core to really understanding all this and to help the business into making the best decisions in terms of sustainability, but also continue investing in hypergrowth. And I think that has been one. And the other, I think it's how to, for me, one of the biggest pain points is the connection between different tools that we have. It's still super hard to get a holistic view of the business in a centralized way.
So Bastian is asking as to the best way for team setup for 100 to 300 people company in terms of a marketing function setup. What would you recommend him?
Can you repeat that? From a marketing function?
From a finance team setup.
Ah, okay, sorry. I was like, I'm not sure you want to hear the marketing setup from a finance team.
Did I say marketing?
I also heard marketing.
Okay,
Yeah.
well,
So
let me take it back. Yes, finance team setup. Sorry.
Yeah, usually it's not the best team to ask that question. Jokes aside, no. I think you need to build for the scale and for the needs that you have. If you are planning heavy because your accounting is relatively simple, or controllership is relatively simple, your internal audit is relatively simple, invest heavily on that because that brings a huge value, like business partnership and finance and strategies where you can drive a lot of the business decisions and where we can enable. For us, it was very different. Like we had to invest heavily on the accounting side, even partnering with a shared service center, so we could scale globally very quickly. Treasury was critical. Like when you flow millions of dollars across the world on a regular basis, it's critical. So we had to start building those functions. Tax, like 100 entities, or tax structure and intercompany flows are massive. So for us, it was super important. I think, as always, like look at your need, but finance and strategy, I think, is where you usually reap the highest benefits.
Yeah, I think for me, maybe just quickly adding to that, for me also something Pedro mentioned earlier, the most critical point for me is to try to invest as early as possible, given that it's like depending on what your growth ambitions are, you will always be too late and you will always be behind the curve. So the idea is to anticipate where you want to grow to and what is the kind of setup that you will need in a year or 2 years from now, and then building towards this as early as possible, which also means you need to have this conversation with your CEO early on, given that finance is typically the team that is left behind, since initial resources after funding are typically invested into product or sales and marketing. So have this conversation early on to make sure, that you can keep up with the pace of the company.
There's another interesting question, I think, for Lily. As a young and successful professional, do you have challenges to manage and coach the experienced folks you mentioned when building out your teams?
I think it's, I think the short answer to that is yes, but I think it always depends on how you approach it. So like everyone will have features and bugs, and it just really depends on how you approach what you're viewing as a feature or bug in terms of age and experience. I think what always helps is if you can lead with a firm understanding of your business, your market, and your opportunity, that is what's the most value add to your business. And if you're very honest about what you don't know well, what your competencies are not, and you hire for those positions, that's what you need to do, right? No one expects you to know everything across all your sub-functions, across finance and accounting. That's an impossible task. But can you hire people to supplement and complement you? And then can you give them the runway and the tools to be successful? And are you also being critical about really hiring folks who want to work autonomously and want to have a ton of ownership and presenting that as an opportunity?
Cool, thank you. And I think this one's for Pedro. What are the first red flags when investing too much on growth for you?
First red flags, the board will tell you. It's easy. Now, look, I think you need to understand and start. The challenge of hypergrowth is the lack of data. So you go from zero remote to, I joined 2 years ago, we were 19 people, zero revenue. Today, we are almost 1,000 people and or just crossed 1,000 people, and the business is growing massively. So 2 years of data, you need to play it very well. What does it tell you? Like you don't also want to be guided on the wrong direction because your data is insufficient and is not statistically relevant. But you need to understand efficiencies. You need to understand deviations to what you were expecting. So you design a plan, and tracking and adjusting that plan to what you know today, it's critical. But very early on, you start understanding the different team efficiencies, and that's relatively easy to start tracking, because you start building a pattern. Because also you are investing heavily, which means that you are also building a lot of data points for yourself. But this balance between not having enough data, but also really being very critical with the data that you have, I think is how we are enabling those red flags.
I think if I could add to that, you also need to be realistic about your runway and the bets that you're making and the time frame that you expect them to play out, right? When you're really early on, no one will have a repeatable sales motion. You will never have enough data to feel comfortable making the decisions that you are. But if you're very clear about the assumptions that you're making, the results that you want to see, and then the retro process and the adjustment process of what's the gap, what's driving the gap, and do we actually feel comfortable enough about the gap to continue to spend money here, and for how long? The limiting factor, if you're a private company, or also if you're public, is like, what's your cash balance and what's the runway, and what do you need to succeed in before you, and what do you need to prove out from a business? Like, what are your goals?
And as a follow-up question, I see actually one that's quite relevant is Florian is suggesting, how about merging finance and data functions into one department? What are your thoughts about that?
I've seen that before. It really depends on your organization and the complexity. I think also if your data needs, our data organization rolls up into engineering, because we have pretty specific like data engineering needs, but they're also fully built out on the data analysts and data scientist side that like support business needs across product and finance. So I think it really depends on also you and who else your leaders are in terms of, do they understand what it takes to build a data function? What's the priority level of building a data function? And what's the level of specialization needed? I think there's also a resource allocation question where it's probably easier to grow a data team if it's within engineering. So versus within like a G&A cost center, which is also consideration if you're trying to build a bigger team there.
Cool, thank you. And I think we'll take one or two last questions before wrapping this up. I see a question that's very relevant to today's topic, and I'll ask it over to Michael. What strategies have been successful for each of you to build the presence and understanding of the finance team's function across the company? Especially in a remote first world, it's obviously hard to sometimes get seen, and it's all about really the outcomes of what you're creating in terms of day-to-day work. So Michael, how have you kind of kept afloat thinking along those lines?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is definitely challenging, and even more challenging in a remote world. I think it requires constant communication, and it's also requiring like communication on all levels. You also need to make sure you adapt your communication depending on who you're talking to, because obviously, you know, there is a certain level of understanding around, you know, your financials and around the core KPIs and the goals that you've set up in the company, in your finance team, ideally also on the leadership team level. But, you know, depending on your level of transparency, this will reduce the further you go out into the company. And therefore you need to make sure that you take a step on where you want to be with regards to transparency. And we as a company, for example, strive to be extremely transparent towards the entire organization, so that they know, you know, how do we track against our targets, but also, you know, what's our runway and how do we you know, are going with regards to achieving our goals in general, and then making sure you iterate on this constantly and explain these in regular setups. And, you know, we've started out with monthly business reviews, which we of course have in smaller cycles where or circles with the people that can directly drive the metrics there. But then we also constantly share this across the entire organization, and also allow for questions and have regular forums where people can then also approach us and ask additional questions to get the full context. That's at least what has played out well for us on this end.
Great, thank you. So I think we will wrap it up on that note. So I just want to say thank you again to our speakers for taking the time out of their very busy days to come speak with us and share some knowledge. And thank you for everybody for tuning in. As a reminder, there will be a follow-up email with a video recap as well. So again, thanks again for tuning in, and I hope you all have a wonderful day, and we will see you on the next event very soon. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye-bye.